There's something about returning to T-sequence narratives that feels less like starting a story and more like noticing one that was already unfolding. This one rests in the quiet spaces where preparation happens without witness. It started long before anyone realized there was something to prepare for. There were lists, though no one saw them. Not dramatic lists, not urgent, just small columns of handwriting in the back of a notebook that usually stayed closed. Groceries, written twice in different inks, dates circled lightly, then erased, then circled again, a page folded at the corner and smoothed back down so it wouldn't look intentional. Nothing about it looked like planning for departure. It looked like someone trying to be responsible. Drawers were reorganized slowly. Old receipts were sorted into labeled envelopes. A box of cables was untangled, each one coiled carefully instead of shoved back into the drawer. Passwords were rewritten more clearly. A spare key was tested in the lock and then returned to its place without comment. If anyone had asked, the answer would have been simple. I'm just getting organized. And that would have been true. The planning never arrived all at once. It accumulated. A folder appeared on the desktop of a laptop that was rarely used for anything serious. Inside were scanned documents. Nothing alarming. Identification, insurance, a copy of a lease agreement from years ago. The folder had a neutral name. It did not draw attention. At dinner, there were questions that sounded casual. Do you still talk to your cousin in Denver? Do you remember how long it took to get approved for that job? The tone was light, curious, almost forgettable. The questions drifted across the table and dissolved before anyone thought to hold on to them. There were small experiments: waking up earlier, driving a different route home, cooking meals that could be portioned and frozen, looking up average rent prices in cities that had never been mentioned out loud. It didn't feel like escape, it felt like possibility. In the evenings, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into its usual sounds, there would be a quiet inventory taken in the mind, not of objects, of weight. How heavy does this feel today? The answer was never catastrophic. It was never dramatic enough to justify a scene. It was simply noted, compared to yesterday, compared to last month. There was a spreadsheet, though no one else would have recognized it as significant. Numbers entered slowly, savings recalculated, subscriptions reviewed and quietly canceled. A streaming service disappeared from the television menu and no one asked why. Plans were made for contingencies that might never come. If the car breaks down, if the job changes, if something unexpected happens. Each scenario was walked through privately, as if rehearsing a conversation that might never take place. The planning became a form of self-soothing, a way of saying, if everything shifts, I will not be surprised. There were moments when it almost stopped, days when laughter felt easier, when the house felt warm enough to stay. On those days, the notebook remained closed, the folder untouched. But the planning had already begun to live beneath the surface. It didn't require urgency anymore. It required consistency. There were documents requested from old employers, references updated quietly, a resume rewritten without announcing that it had been opened at all. The font was changed, the spacing adjusted, the tone softened. Applications were saved but not sent. A suitcase was checked for broken zippers, not packed, just checked. The spare room was decluttered under the explanation of making space. Old clothes were folded into donation bags. Books were boxed and labeled in case they ever needed to be moved quickly. No one noticed because nothing looked different. The same routines continued, the same greetings at the door, the same conversations about weather and errands and minor inconveniences. The planning existed in the margins. Sometimes it was just research, reading about neighborhoods at night, watching videos about cities where no one knew their name, calculating commute times from apartments they would never see. It felt less like running away and more like keeping a door unlocked. There were conversations imagined but never spoken. I've been thinking, I need something different. I didn't know how to say this before. Each sentence practiced silently, then put away like a fragile object.
There was no fight that triggered it, no single disappointment that could be pointed to as the cause. The planning was not revenge. It was not a reaction. It was a response to something slower, a gradual thinning. Days when words felt heavier to carry, when explanations required more energy than they were worth, when being understood felt optional. The planning filled that space. It offered structure where conversation did not. A new bank account was opened online, not to hide, just to separate. A small amount transferred at first, then another, a quiet redistribution of security. Important phone numbers were memorized instead of saved, copies of ID placed in a second location. The planning did not interrupt daily life, it threaded through it. Groceries were still bought, birthdays still acknowledged, bills still paid on time, smiles still offered in the morning. But underneath, there was measurement. How much longer could this continue without something inside beginning to close? No one noticed because nothing was announced. There were no dramatic exits rehearsed in front of mirrors, no ultimatums, no packed car idling in the driveway, just contingency, just readiness. The planning even became gentler over time, less frantic, more precise. It stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like maintenance. Updating documents annually, checking savings quarterly, revisiting the notebook to cross out items that were no longer relevant. The suitcase was moved from the top shelf to a place that was easier to reach, not because it was needed, because access mattered. There were late-night walks taken alone, routes chosen deliberately to pass quiet streets, imagining what it would feel like to walk these same steps somewhere else, the air in a different city, the silence in a different room. The idea of leaving no longer felt sharp, it felt calm. There were moments when someone would say, "You've been quiet lately," and the answer would come easily, "Just thinking," which was also true. Thinking about leases and job boards and the cost of moving trucks, thinking about how to tell the story in a way that would not wound anyone, thinking about whether telling it was necessary at all. The planning did not accuse, it prepared. Even the phone was cleaned out, photos backed up, old messages archived, a digital clearing of space that looked like organization but felt like rehearsal. If anyone had looked closely, they might have noticed patterns: fewer long-term commitments agreed to, fewer future plans spoken with certainty, a gentle hesitation before saying next year. But people rarely look closely at subtle shifts. Life continued to move at its ordinary pace. The planning became a quiet companion, not urgent, not loud, just present, a reminder that options existed. There were spreadsheets refined to account for inflation, health insurance policies compared, transit systems researched in cities that had once only been names on a map. The mind rehearsed simplicity, a smaller apartment, fewer belongings, a different view from a different window. The planning did not demand that these things happen, it simply ensured they could. Over time, the fear that had once accompanied the idea of change softened, not because circumstances improved dramatically, not because a revelation arrived, but because readiness replaces panic. When you know how you would leave, staying becomes a choice rather than a trap. That realization never needed to be spoken aloud. It lived in the notebook, in the folder, in the savings account with a name no one else knew. Some evenings, the notebook was opened and nothing new was added, just a quiet review, a confirmation that the pieces were still in place. There was comfort in that, even if no one else understood why. The planning never became visible enough to invite confrontation. It never crossed into obvious preparation. There was no stack of boxes by the door, no farewell letters drafted, just small alignments. A lease end date noted, a job application finally submitted without announcement, an email exchanged with someone in another city, casual in tone but meaningful in direction. The world outside remained unaware. Conversations at the dinner table continued as they always had. Laughter rose and fell, dishes were washed, lights were turned off at the same hour. And under it all, a quiet architecture stood ready. If the day ever arrived when leaving was necessary, the steps would already be known, the documents gathered, the savings measured, the route mapped. But even if that day never came, the planning had already done its work. It had restored something internal, a sense of agency that required no applause. No one noticed the planning because it never demanded to be seen. It existed in restraint, in the careful folding of papers, in the silent recalculations, in the way someone can be fully present in a room while also knowing exactly how to step out of it. The most profound preparations rarely make noise. They are built in the background of ordinary days. And sometimes the power is not in leaving, it is in knowing you could. Some plans don't announce themselves, they simply wait, fully formed in the quiet. If this felt familiar in some way, you might leave a quiet like or subscribe to return to these moments again. You've been listening to T-Sequence Narratives. Some moments don't end, they just stop being spoken about.